How's it going, everyone? Bowers here, and today I'm bringing you the next installment of the League of Legends Beginner Guides, which is going to be like a 2-episode part. So in the next few episodes, we're going to be covering champion roles and lanes. Specifically, we're going to be covering the following things. In the first episode today, we're going to be looking at a general description of what are the roles and what champions fit into what roles. And then in the second episode, we'll be looking at typical lanes for the roles, strengths and weaknesses, and just other meta-related information. So I've been seeing a lot of new players struggling to figure out where certain champions are best played, but I just wanted to put a disclaimer at the start of the video saying that I encourage you to experiment and play every kind of champion or every champion in whatever role you want to play them in. In lower levels and divisions, it really doesn't matter what champion you play in what role, as long as you have an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of that champion and the kind of matchups. So basically find a champion or playstyle that you like playing first, and then start to worry about the most effective way to play them or what role or what lane to play them in. So the first point we are going to look at is basically just going to be an outline of the roles in League of Legends. If you go and look at the champions in the client, you can see that Riot has given each champion a primary and secondary role. And while these are mostly accurate, sometimes they can be a little kind of off the mark or just a bit too specific or niche. So I'm going to break down in a general sense so you can understand, if you're a new player, what kind of roles there basically are in League of Legends. So the basic roles or general roles we have are as follows. First, we have full tanks, which are kind of low damage, very hard to kill, which build mostly defensive stats, being health, armor, and magic resistance. They provide a lot of the CC or crowd control in their team from their kit, and they often act as a front line to either engage or to peel or protect their carries. Next, we have bruisers or juggernauts, and these guys deal decent to moderate damage and slightly less tanky than the full tanks, and they build a mix of offensive and defensive stats, leaning more towards defensive or hybrid items, and they often act as the frontline or divers in the team comp. They can be harder to balance because when they're too strong, they're like just a nightmare for carries. They have enough damage to kill you, but at the same time, you don't have enough damage to kill them because they're too tanky, and when they're weak, they just get kited and die before they can get to anyone and do anything. Next role we have our assassins, and these guys are the high burst damage, high mobility champions, and normally a bit squishier or lower health, and they're designed to eliminate higher priority targets like the enemy AP carry or AD carry. Next we have mages. Now these can kind of be broken down into a number of subclasses, being like control, poke, burst, and utility kind of mages. But basically they just bring ranged AP damage or ability power damage, magic damage to the team. They can bring very high burst damage or long range poke or zone control. It really depends on the champion. It's very specific, and they're normally lower health as well. Utility mages often support, as they have skills in their kit that can assist the AD carry in the lane phase and just further down in the team fights. And then the last role we have is AD carries. So these can either be auto attack based or AD casters. So these are basically marksmen or like just ranged physical damage dealers. And they're often also low health but very high damage mid to late game and weaker earlier on. Now we're going to look at what kind of champions fit into these roles specifically. Now many champions in the game are kind of a hybrid between two roles, and it really depends on how they're built specifically, like item wise. For example, Yasuo and Fizz can both be played as like very high damage assassins in the mid lane, or they can be like really tanky bruisers in the top lane, depending on like their item builds. So very few champions fit perfectly into one role, but for this video I'm going to give you guys just like some examples as to what kind of champions you can expect to fill what roles. So kind of like, the generic poster boys and girls of each roles, and we're going to look at why it is they are best suited to that role and not a different role. So first we're going to look back at tanks. Now tanks have good base damages but poor scalings normally on their abilities, meaning they do good damage naturally but they get very little benefit from building more damage through their items. And they normally have a decent amount of crowd control in their kit so that they can act as an engage tool or appeal protective unit for their carries in team fights. So full tanks are best built like completely defensively. They may have elements on their kit that make them naturally tanky as well, such as like a Malphite passive. And champions that make strong full tanks are champions like Malphite, Maokai, Rammus, and Sion. And then you have some tanks that can be built with like some hybrid damage items that give both offensive and defensive stats. So while still remaining tanky, they get a little more damage behind their abilities if they have more than 1 or 2 damaging abilities. Mixed in with their crowd control, obviously. And these are champions like Gragas, Amumu, and Rek'Sai. And then there's other champions that get naturally more damage just through building tanky just by their kit, like Volibear, who gets more damage on his W, his bite, just from building flat health, and Galio, who gets more AP for all the magic resist he builds. So moving on to bruisers. Bruisers often have better scalings on their abilities, but often lack the mobility to survive long enough to get in range to deal damage. So they sort of resort to building hybrid tanky damage items to make them tanky enough to get in range and deal damage. These are kind of champions like Darius, Renekton, Aurelia, and Trundle. Now moving on, we have Assassins. So as I said before, these guys have some of the highest burst damage in the game. It's just how they're designed. They often shine in the mid game where the enemy carries haven't built any defensive items yet. Assassins can snowball really, really hard, and they can be monsters in the late game as well, but they often struggle to get onto their targets as the game gets later. Carries start to build items to counter their bursts, like Zhonya's and Guardian Angel, and teams are more focused on protecting their carries in late game team fights. Champions that make good assassins are champions like Zed, Fizz, LeBlanc, Kha'Zix, and Rengar. Now next we have mages. Again, as I said earlier, there's kind of different subclasses of mages, but in a general sense, they all often are either a hybrid of 1 or 2, or like just a mix of all of them. Champions like Victor, Anivia, and Orianna, while they can have very high bursts and like almost one-shot in any enemy carry mid to late game, they can also offer zone control or utility, like Anivia's War, Victor's Gravity Field, and Orianna's Shield. And then we have poke mages, which have like very long range spells that are on a low cooldown, and they're normally immobile, making them easier targets for flanking assassins, but they can play back very safe due to their long range. So these are champions like Ziggs, Xerath, and Vel'Koz and Lux. Finally, we have utility mages, which often lead towards a more protective playstyle, and they're often played as supports. They normally offer like heals and shields and disengage tools and buffs like damage buffs or attack speed or movement speed buffs to offer their team or their other carries. These are champions like Janna, Lulu, Nami, Soraka, and Karma. Now finally, we can move on to AD carries. So these can either be auto attack base, and they scale better into the late game, and they place more emphasis on building crit, attack damage, and attack speed. They rely mostly on their autos to do most of their damage, but they take a bit longer to ramp up into the late game, or their abilities add more damage to their autos, like a Caitlyn Headshot or Vayne Silver Bolts. So these are champions like, again, Vayne, Caitlyn, Jinx, Ashe, and Kog'Maw. And then we have AD casters, which rely more on their abilities to do damage rather than their auto attacks. And they tend to spike a little bit earlier in the mid game, but eventually they get outscaled in the late game by the auto attack based AD carries. They place more emphasis on attack damage and armor pen and CDR or cooldown reduction rather than crit chance and attack speed. These are champions kind of like Lucian, Corki, and Ezreal, but there's also champions like Graves who kind of fill this weird hybrid niche between AD caster and bruiser. Anyway guys, that'll be all for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something from the video. In the next episode, we'll be applying the knowledge we gained from today's video while we take a look at kind of lane preferences for the roles we covered, strengths and weaknesses, and some meta-related content. So thank you so much for watching. Be sure to tune in for the next video and subscribe if you haven't already, and have a great day.